everyone, and welcome back to this series on the history of Assyria. Now today we're going to be talking about a very powerful king, Tiglath-Pileser I. So without further ado, let's begin. So in the last part, we met Tikulti-Ninurta, one of the great kings of the Middle Assyrian Empire. His reign started with great promise, and he was able to annex a lot of territory for his ever-expanding empire. However, the tide began to turn for him after he sacked the great and, you could say, somewhat holy city of Babylon, while also shortly afterward embellishing his palace and offshoot capital, Tikulti-Ninurta. Now this new city, if you call it that, was actually across the river from Ashur, the historical capital, actually you could say historical and sacred capital of the ancient Assyrians. Anyway, the people of Ashur started to see that Tikulti-Ninurta was kind of acting a bit recklessly, building all these palaces for himself, basically squandering the funds that he actually looted from the Holy Temple in Babylon. This actually brought a lot of the population, meaning the Assyrian population, against him, because even though they were Assyrians, they still viewed Babylon as a holy city, and for his actions, it was just something that was unheard of, to go sack one of the greatest cities of the ancient world of that time, and also its holiest temple, the Temple to Marduk. So consequently, Tikulti-Ninurta was murdered by one of his own sons in 1207 BCE, which left his royal house in a very weak state. Political instability ensued for a good 100 years or so, until a new king, who went by the throne name of Tiglath-Pileser I, came to power. Now many scholars credit this king with forming a real empire. Now the kings that had followed Tikulti-Ninurta I were content with maintaining the empire that had been given to them. Whether it's that, or that they lacked charisma, intelligence, or simply good management skills, they really did nothing to expand Assyria's borders or to improve the lot of their people. On the contrary, they began losing territory left and right to invading tribes or rebellious factions within their own empire. Most of these Assyrian kings also had short reigns and were more or less inept during the years in which they ruled. In 1115 BCE, a new king came to the throne. He took the name Tiglath-Pileser I, meaning, "My trust is in the son of Ashur." And according to cuneiform records that have been left behind, he was quite a remarkable persona. Tiglath-Pileser began his reign restoring the old temples that had been neglected during the rule of his predecessors, as well as building new ones, something that helped to endear him to the population. In fact, he seems to have been a very pious king, for he writes in many of his inscriptions the details of how he himself personally worked to help build several temples. For example, he tells how he leveled the earth, how much land he cleared, the dimensions of the temple, and details of the personal sacrifices that he himself made. It's safe to say that he took religion quite seriously. Perhaps he needed to. After all, the Assyrian Empire had been in a more or less lethargic state for nearly a century. As mentioned earlier, previous kings had lost territory, and several subject peoples had successfully rebelled and declared their independence from Assyria. Tiglath-Pileser was determined to reverse Assyria's most recent misfortunes, and for that, he needed all the help from the gods that he could get. Now, once he'd taken care of the temples and commissioned other building projects, in 1112 BCE, Tiglath-Pileser mounted his first campaign against a people known as the Mushki. Basically, they had taken over a sliver of Assyrian territory in Anatolia called Kadmuk. This, though, was not a war of expansion, but rather a defensive war, since the Mushki had already been encroaching on Assyrian territories in the decades prior. It was only when they crossed into Kadmuk, closer to the Assyrian heartland, that Tiglath-Pileser became alarmed and went out to face them. According to Assyrian records that Tiglath-Pileser commissioned, it was a bloody and punishing campaign for the enemy. He describes it as such, and I quote, "In the beginning of my reign, 20,000 of the Mushkayans and their 5 kings, who for 50 years had held the countries of Alza and Perukuz, without paying tribute and offerings to Ashur my lord, and whom a king of Assyria had never ventured to meet in battle, betook themselves to their strength, and went and seized the country of Kadmuka. In the service of Ashur my lord, my chariots and warriors I assembled after me. The country of Kasiyaya, a difficult country, I passed through. With their 20,000 fighting men and their 5 kings in the country of Kadmuka I engaged. I defeated them. The ranks of their warriors in fighting the battle were beaten down as if by the tempest. Their carcasses covered the valleys and the tops of the mountains. I cut off their heads. The battlements of their cities I made heaps of, like mounds of earth. Their movables, their wealth, and their valuables I plundered to a countless amount. 6,000 of their common soldiers who fled before my servants and accepted my yoke, I took them, and I gave them over to the men of my own territory. Then I went into the country of Kadmuka, which was disobedient and withheld the tribute and offerings due to Ashur my lord. I conquered the whole country of Kadmuka. I plundered their movables, their wealth, and their valuables. Their cities I burned with fire. I destroyed and ruined. End of quote. Yeah, so as you can see, he's pretty graphic. After this, he went on to conquer a land called Nairi, which today is part of Syria and the Levant. Nairi, though, seems as if it was not a single kingdom, but more like a confederacy of city-states, because Tiglath-Pileser talks of encountering the 60 kings of Nairi. The campaign was successful, at least in terms of the spoils of war, because cuneiform tablets indicate that the Assyrians came in possession of thousands of cattle and herds of oxen, horses, sheep, grain, and vessels made out of precious and other useful metals. Those who were captives of war were often displaced from their homes and forced to work on new lands that had been captured by the Assyrian army. So this again was a policy of displacement where the Assyrians rather, would take their captives and send them to a different land to work, a land that they weren't attached to. Basically, it was their way of taking them away from their home so that they would be less likely to rebel. Now, the Mushki and the Nairi weren't the only peoples with whom the Assyrians had military conflicts with. A greater threat, at least in the long term, came from the migration into Assyrian territory of a people known as the Arameans. Now, you're going to hear a lot about these people from this point in history forward because they were an extremely influential group throughout the ancient Near East. Actually, much beyond that, as we also come across them in Middle to late antiquity as well. The first time, though, that they are actually mentioned anywhere in the written record is by Tiglath-Pileser I. Their origins are believed to have been from the Jebel Bishri area of what is today Syria. It seems, though, that a series of deforestation and droughts, both affecting the quality of the soil in their homeland, had been pushing many Arameans eastward into the territory claimed by the Assyrians. The latter were forced to push them back numerous times. In fact, Tiglath-Pileser claims that he crossed the Euphrates 28 times in pursuit of them. Other campaigns took Tiglath-Pileser and his men all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. These were campaigns of expansion into new territories, places of wonder that obviously impressed the Assyrians. For example, on one occasion, Tiglath-Pileser boasts that he ventured into the Mediterranean Sea on a boat and killed what he calls a seahorse with a harpoon. Whether this was really a type of whale or a dolphin is not known, but he bragged a lot about the experience and had a mural depicting the event at the entrance of his palace in Ashur. This, though, wasn't the only species of animal that the Assyrian king was known to have hunted. Several texts record that the king used to hunt lions, tigers, bears, hyenas, leopards, deer, and wild goats. This seems strange because many of these animals no longer appear in the Middle East. However, in those days, with fewer humans encroaching on their natural habitats, there may have indeed been many more in number. Tiglath-Pileser also kept a personal zoo, so it's possible that some of these animals were brought from other lands and kept there to be hunted later. Anyway, back to the more political history. Along with conflict with peoples to the north and the east, Tiglath-Pileser, like his predecessors before him, had to deal with that great kingdom to the south, Babylonia. For the past several centuries, these two kingdoms, though they had a lot in common, were great rivals. They were constantly clashing with each other along their borders, usually with neither side gaining anything of real significance. The exception, of course, was during the reign of Tikulti-Ninurta I, some 100 years before. We actually covered that in the previous video of this series, so definitely check it out if you want to know more. Now, the kings after Tikulti-Ninurta I were pretty complacent in terms of their policy with Babylonia. There might have been a few cross-border raids here and there, but nothing significant. Tiglath-Pileser I, though, was different. Maybe he had a lot of confidence from his campaigns in Anatolia and towards the Mediterranean. Whatever it was, the Assyrian king invaded Babylonia and captured several northern cities, including the capital, Babylon. Tiglath-Pileser, though, was a bit more cautious than his predecessor, Tikulti-Ninurta. Tiglath only destroyed the city's central palace, and as far as we know, didn't loot any temples or cause major destruction to the city's other important buildings. In addition, he didn't make himself the king there or annex Babylon into his empire. It seems that his campaign in Babylonia was merely a punitive one to firmly establish his southern border and exact some tribute. It was also probably to weaken the Babylonians just enough so that they would never launch another raid into Assyrian territory again. Now it may seem that I'm making Tiglath-Pileser out to be this amazing, godlike persona, the next Sargon of Akkad or a legendary figure such as Gilgamesh. Yes, the man was a great conqueror, but he also had his flaws. Many of them, actually. For example, while he was good at conquering new lands and terrorizing their inhabitants, he was often not able to hold on to all of them. I think the honest truth, though, is that the Assyrians at the time just didn't have the manpower to hold every conquered territory and exact tribute from all of them. Another thing is that Tiglath-Pileser was known as a lawgiver. He had his own law code established, which was in some ways similar to that of Hammurabi. The main difference, though, was that the code's punishments were extremely harsh, especially towards women. I mean, if you thought that an eye for an eye was cruel, listen to some of these. I quote, "If a woman has procured a miscarriage by her own act, when they have prosecuted her and convicted her, they shall impale her on stakes without burying her. If she died in having the miscarriage, they shall impale her on stakes without burying her." End of quote. That basically was the punishment for abortion. We also know that wives, widows, concubines, and daughters of nobility had to be veiled in public. A woman who went out in the street without a veil, or even the proper type of veil according to her status, could have her ears cut off by the Assyrian police. All men were supposed to enforce this rule. If a man saw a woman not wearing a veil or doing something else that was considered socially unacceptable, he had to report that woman to the authorities instantly or risk punishment by 50 lashes, mutilation, and/or enslavement for up to a month. Yeah, Tiglath-Pileser's code of laws was pretty misogynistic, let alone cruel. Although his campaign spread far and wide and brought the Assyrians great wealth, Tiglath-Pileser never firmly established Assyrian rule in the conquered territories. He died in 1076 BCE and was succeeded by his son, Asharid-apal-Ikur, who continued his father's policies but made no real additions to his realm. Perhaps this was the fact that he only reigned for 2 years, after which the throne was assumed by another brother, Ashur-bel-Kala, who the records state was challenged by a usurper. This also had the effect of plunging the Assyrian Empire into a civil war that allowed the regions that had not already left the empire to now boldly declare their autonomy. For example, the Arameans, who had never been totally defeated, rose up against the Assyrians and took back the lands that they had lost in the west. Thus, the empire endured a period of stagnation that would not be reversed until the rise of Adad-nirari II in 912 BCE. It would be he who would establish what historians dub the Neo-Assyrian Empire, a political and military entity that would dominate and terrorize the ancient Near East for the next 300 years. Anyway, that's all for now. Thanks everyone for stopping by. If you like this video, please hit that subscribe button and actually hit the like button too. It really helps out the channel a lot. Stay tuned for the next installment of the History of Assyria. Until next time.